Dr. Robert Mitchell's hands trembled as he stared at the test results, his coffee mug slipping from his fingers and shattering against the clinic floor. 23 years of medicine had never prepared him for this. The lab report wasn't showing cancer or infection, it was revealing systematic poisoning from counterfeit medications. Nurse Sarah gasped from the doorway, her clipboard clattering to the ground as she witnessed her mentor's ashen face. The elderly woman in room 3 had been slowly killing herself trying to save money, buying fake drugs online for 5 agonizing months. Dorothy Mae Henderson sat waiting beyond the thin wall, her weathered hands clutching 20 crumpled dollar bills and a Medicare card, unaware that her desperate attempt at thrift had nearly cost her life. The faded floral scarf around her neck, Earl's favorite pattern, couldn't hide the devastating wounds anymore. "Get the specialist on the phone." "Now." His voice cracked, despite years of delivering difficult news. How many others were out there, dying in silence because they couldn't afford to live? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty Venetian blinds of Dorothy Mae Henderson's modest ranch house, casting long shadows across the living room that hadn't changed since 1987. At 67, Dolly still maintained the same careful routine Earl had loved: coffee at 6, evening news at 5:30, and Sunday dinner preparations that filled the quiet kitchen with familiar aromas. But the silence felt different now, heavier somehow, without his gentle humming drifting from the workshop or his weathered hands reaching across the breakfast table. Dolly adjusted the faded floral scarf around her neck, the one Earl always said brought out the blue in her eyes, and surveyed her kingdom of memories. The Purple Heart displayed proudly on the mantelpiece caught the dying light, flanked by 45 years of wedding photos and school pictures of her grandchildren. Twin 8-year-olds Lily and Rose grinned gap-toothed from their latest portrait, while their father Jimmy's graduation photo from trade school reminded her of Earl's proud smile that day. Her monthly budget lay spread across the kitchen table where every major family decision had been made, the same Formica surface where they'd planned Jimmy's wedding, celebrated Becca's nursing school acceptance, and held Earl's trembling hand during those final weeks. The numbers told their brutal story: $1,847, Social Security, minus $892 for house expenses, $156 for medications, $89 for utilities. What remained barely covered groceries, let alone the mounting medical bills that still arrived addressed to Earl Henderson, each envelope a paper-knife twist of grief. The house felt too big now, too quiet, except for the sympathetic purring of Mittens, Earl's orange tabby who'd taken to sleeping on his side of the bed. Sometimes Dolly caught herself setting 2 places at dinner or calling out, "Earl, honey, did you hear that?" when the old pipes groaned or the floorboards settled. Mrs. Chen next door had taken to bringing extra soup, too much for one person, she'd claim with knowing eyes. And their conversations over the fence had become Dolly's primary human contact since Earl's passing. Independence had been her birthright, inherited from Depression-era parents who taught her that asking for help was admitting defeat. She'd raised 2 children while Earl worked double shifts at the plant, managed their finances, tended the garden that still bloomed with his favorite roses. Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. The family motto that had carried them through. Lean years now felt like a prison sentence, in a world where medication cost more than groceries and doctor visits rivaled mortgage payments. The itching at her neck had started as a whisper in March, barely noticeable while deadheading Earl's roses. Now it demanded attention, a constant reminder that her body, like everything else she'd once trusted, was beginning to betray her. She touched the scarf gently, remembering Earl's fingers tracing the same spot where he used to kiss her goodnight, and wondered how much longer she could pretend that everything was still manageable, still under control. The first scratch came on a Tuesday morning in mid-March, so subtle that Dolly almost missed it while deadheading Earl's prize-winning roses. The Colorado spring air carried that familiar bite of late winter fighting against approaching warmth, and she'd attributed the mild tingling to nothing more than seasonal change. "Earl always said March weather could drive a person crazy," she murmured to the garden, her voice the only sound breaking the suburban silence. By Thursday, the tingling had transformed into a persistent itch that seemed to pulse beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. Standing in the cramped bathroom mirror, Dolly examined the small red patch on her neck, no bigger than a quarter. It looked innocent enough, probably just dry skin from the harsh Colorado wind. She'd lived through 67 winters. Surely she could handle a little irritation. The local drugstore's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dolly studied the endless array of creams and lotions, their promises of relief gleaming from colorful packages. Her arthritic fingers counted the crumpled bills in her purse, grocery money that would have to stretch until next month's Social Security check. The hydrocortisone cream cost $7.89, nearly a day's worth of meals, but the itching had begun to interfere with her sleep. "Just this once," she whispered, approaching the pharmacy counter where a young clerk barely looked up from his phone. The transaction felt like a small betrayal of Earl's careful budgeting, but surely he would understand. After all, he'd always said her health came first, back when they could afford for it to come first. The relief lasted exactly 3 days. By the following Tuesday, the itching had returned with vengeance, spreading beyond the original patch and bringing with it an angry redness that seemed to pulse under her collar. Dolly found herself scratching unconsciously during her morning coffee, her nails leaving thin red lines that stung in the shower. Sunday dinner at Jimmy's house had been a family tradition for 15 years, but as Dolly adjusted her high-necked blouse in the rearview mirror, she felt the weight of maintaining appearances. 8-year-old Lily bounded toward her car with the uninhibited joy that only grandchildren possessed, chattering about a school project while Rose trailed behind with a shy smile. "Grandma, why are you wearing a turtleneck? It's not even cold," Lily observed, with the brutal honesty of childhood, reaching up to touch the fabric at Dolly's throat. "Just feeling a little chilly today, sweetheart," Dolly deflected, gently redirecting Lily's attention to the small bag of peppermints she always brought. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but the alternative, worrying her family with what was surely a minor skin problem, seemed worse. Rebecca arrived 20 minutes late, her scrubs wrinkled from a double shift at the nursing home, exhaustion etched in the fine lines around her eyes. As a certified nursing assistant, she'd developed a professional eye for health problems, and Dolly caught her daughter studying her face with concern during grace. "Mom, you look tired. Are you sleeping okay?" Becca's voice carried that particular blend of love and worry that daughters perfected. "Sleep like a baby," Dolly replied, ignoring the irony that babies actually woke frequently during the night, just as she'd been doing for the past week. The scratching had become worse in the dark hours, when consciousness dimmed and her body's protective instincts failed to stop her nails from seeking relief. Jimmy carved the pot roast with the methodical precision he'd inherited from Earl, his calloused hands steady despite the fatigue of another 60-hour work week. Construction jobs had been scarce since his back surgery, and Dolly noticed the way he winced when he thought no one was looking. "How's the job search going, honey?" she asked, genuinely concerned but also grateful for a topic that drew attention away from her own discomfort. "Got a lead on a project in Littleton," Jimmy replied, his voice carrying forced optimism. "Should know by Friday if it comes through." The conversation flowed around topics both spoken and unspoken. Linda's concerns about the twins' grades, Becca's supervisor, who seemed determined to make life difficult, the rising cost of everything from groceries to gas. No one mentioned Earl's empty chair or the way family dynamics had shifted since his death, leaving Dolly as both matriarch and burden, respected elder and potential responsibility. As evening shadows lengthened across Jimmy's modest backyard, Dolly excused herself to the bathroom, ostensibly to freshen up before the drive home. In the harsh vanity lighting, she finally got a clear look at what had been hidden beneath fabric and denial. The red patch had grown, spreading toward her collarbone, and tiny scratches crisscrossed the irritated skin like a road map of sleepless nights. For the first time since Earl's funeral, Dolly felt truly afraid. Not of death. She'd made peace with mortality during those long nights holding Earl's hand in the hospital. No, this was the deeper fear of becoming the very thing she'd spent her lifetime avoiding. A burden, a worry, a problem that her children couldn't afford to solve. She splashed cold water on her face, straightened her shoulders, and returned to kiss her grandchildren goodbye, the performance of normalcy feeling more fragile with each passing day. Easter Sunday arrived with the cruel optimism of Colorado spring, where snow could blanket daffodils without warning and hope felt as fragile as new grass. Dolly sat in her car outside Jimmy's duplex, gathering courage while adjusting the paisley scarf that had become her constant companion. The fabric, once a cheerful accent piece, now served as armor against curious glances and worried questions she wasn't prepared to answer. The wound beneath the scarf had evolved beyond simple irritation into something that demanded acknowledgement. What had begun as a quarter-sized patch now stretched from her collarbone toward her ear, angry and weeping despite her careful applications of drugstore remedies. The smell had started 3 days ago, a sweet, sickly odor that reminded her of fruit left too long in summer heat. Lily and Rose burst through the front door like twin hurricanes, their Easter dresses already bearing evidence of backyard adventures. But as they approached for their customary grandmother hugs, something made them pause. Lily's nose wrinkled in that unguarded way children had before social conditioning taught them to hide their reactions. "Grandma smells funny," Rose whispered to her sister, loud enough for Dolly to hear. The words hit harder than any physical pain, confirming what she'd feared but refused to acknowledge. "Rose Henderson, that's not polite," Linda scolded, but Dolly caught the way her daughter-in-law's eyes darted toward her neck, concern flickering across her features before politeness masked it. The Easter meal unfolded with forced normalcy, everyone working harder than usual to maintain the illusion of celebration. Jimmy carved the ham with extra attention to presentation, Linda fussed over side dishes that didn't need fussing, and the twins chattered about egg hunts and chocolate bunnies with slightly manic enthusiasm. Only Becca remained quiet, her professional instincts clearly engaged as she watched her mother from across the table. "Mom, what's under that scarf?" The question came during dessert, delivered in Becca's no-nonsense voice that had served her well in healthcare settings. "Just a little spring rash, honey. Nothing to worry about." The lie felt increasingly thin, like tissue paper stretched too far. "Can I see it?" "Rebecca Ann, there's no need to make a fuss." "Mom." Becca stood up, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "I work with elderly patients every day. I know what infections look like." The word hung in the air between them, sharp and clinical. Jimmy's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and Linda instinctively moved closer to the twins as if whatever plagued Dolly might somehow contaminate her own family. "It's not an infection," Dolly insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. "I've been taking care of myself since before you were born, and I'll continue." "That's not a rash." Becca had moved around the table, her trained eyes taking in details Dolly had hoped to hide. "Mom, that's an open wound. How long has it been like this?" The interrogation that followed felt like a tribunal. Jimmy joined his sister in demanding answers, his masculine instinct to fix problems frustrated by something beyond his construction skills. The twins were banished to the living room with promises of extra television time, but their excited voices had been replaced by confused whispers about why the adults were using their scary voices. "We need to get you to a doctor," Jimmy declared, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned from years of managing construction crews. "Doctors cost money, James. Money we don't have. We'll figure out the money. Your health comes first." "Money doesn't grow on trees," Dolly snapped, Earl's practical wisdom flowing through her like inherited scripture. "You've got your own problems. The twins need new shoes, your back surgery bills aren't paid, and Linda's working extra shifts just to keep up. I won't be the reason this family goes under." The argument escalated with the particular intensity that only family can achieve, love and frustration intertwining until it became impossible to distinguish protection from control. Becca researched Medicare coverage on her phone while Jimmy calculated rough estimates of medical costs, both siblings united in their determination to overcome their mother's stubborn independence. "I raised 5 children through the Depression," Dolly finally exploded, referring to the siblings she'd helped care for after their parents died young. "I managed this household for 45 years while your father worked double shifts. I held his hand through cancer treatments and buried him with dignity intact. I will not become some helpless old woman who can't take care of herself." The silence that followed felt fragile, broken only by the twins' laughter drifting from the other room and the steady tick of the kitchen clock Earl had given Jimmy for his first apartment. Linda busied herself clearing dishes with the careful movements of someone trying to become invisible, while Jimmy stared at his hands. Earl's hands, Dolly noticed, broad and capable, but somehow defeated. "Mom," Becca said quietly, "being sick doesn't make you helpless. Ignoring sickness until it kills you, that makes you helpless." But Dolly had already retreated behind the walls of pride and practicality that had protected her through decades of struggle. The drive home passed in a blur of streetlights and regret, her hands gripping the steering wheel while the wound beneath her scarf pulsed with each heartbeat. That night, alone in the bedroom she'd shared with Earl for 30 years, Dolly made a decision that felt both practical and devastating. She would handle this herself, the way she'd handled everything else. The internet, she'd heard, offered solutions for people who couldn't afford traditional medicine. Surely there were options for someone willing to be resourceful, someone who understood that survival often required creativity rather than money. She pulled Earl's old laptop from the closet, its dusty screen flickering to life with reluctant cooperation. The blue glow illuminated her face as she typed words she'd never imagined needing. Cheap antibiotics online, and medicine without prescription. The results filled her with hope and terror in equal measure. Websites promising affordable healthcare solutions, testimonials from grateful customers, prices that seemed too good to be true. By dawn, she'd placed her first order, using the emergency credit card she'd sworn never to touch. The medication would arrive in a plain brown package within a week. No questions asked, no insurance required. It felt like salvation and damnation wrapped in the promise of discreet shipping. The brown package arrived on a Tuesday morning with no fanfare, delivered by a postal worker who seemed as eager to leave as Dolly was to receive it. Inside the nondescript envelope, wrapped in bubble wrap and medical-looking packaging, lay what she hoped would be her salvation, a 2-week supply of antibiotics that had cost her $47 instead of the $300 the pharmacy had quoted. The pills looked legitimate enough, small white tablets with official-looking markings that matched the pictures she'd studied online. The accompanying documentation, while printed on thin paper that felt insubstantial, carried medical terminology that seemed appropriately complex. Relief flooded through her as she read the dosage instructions, imagining Earl's approving nod at her resourcefulness. 2 pills twice daily with food, she read aloud to Mittens, who had taken to following her around the house as if sensing her distress. The orange tabby watched with Earl's same expression of patient concern as she swallowed the first dose with her morning coffee. By the end of the first week, Dolly's optimism had transformed into something approaching desperation. Rather than improving, the wound seemed to be spreading with a malevolent persistence that defied her home remedies and online medications. The angry red patch now extended past her collar, creeping toward her shoulder with fingers of inflammation that burned constantly. Mrs. Chen appeared at the fence one morning, carrying a thermos of homemade soup and wearing the expression of someone who'd been watching and worrying from a respectful distance. Her English, though accented, carried the precise concern of a woman who had raised 6 children and buried 1 husband. "Dorothy, you look very thin," she observed, her dark eyes taking in details that Dolly had hoped weren't obvious. "My daughter Lucy, she is doctor. Maybe she could look—" "I'm fine, Mrs." "Oh, Chen, just getting older, you know how it is." But even as she spoke the words, Dolly caught her reflection in Mrs. Chen's kitchen window and realized how untrue they sounded. The woman staring back looked haggard, drawn, with eyes that held the particular exhaustion of someone fighting a losing battle. The scarf around her neck seemed less like a fashion choice and more like a bandage, poorly concealing something that demanded professional attention. The second package of pills arrived during a rainstorm that hammered against the windows with unusual violence, as if nature itself was trying to break through her isolation. These tablets looked different, slightly yellower, with markings that seemed less precise than the first batch. But the price had been even better, and the testimonials on the website had been convincing enough to overcome her growing doubts. Becca called on a Thursday evening, her voice strained with the particular exhaustion that came from dealing with difficult patients and insufficient staffing at the nursing home. "Mom, how are you feeling? You sounded tired when we talked Sunday." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just keeping busy with the garden." Another lie, but easier than explaining that she'd barely had energy to water Earl's roses, let alone tend to the vegetable garden that had once provided fresh produce for the entire family. "Maybe I could come by this weekend. I could help with some cleaning, or we could go grocery shopping together." The offer, delivered with careful casualness, represented exactly what Dolly feared most, becoming the kind of burden that required management rather than simply love. "That's not necessary, Rebecca. I'm managing perfectly well." But after hanging up the phone, Dolly caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror and wondered if managing well had become indistinguishable from slow deterioration. The face looking back seemed older than 67, marked not just by time, but by something deeper. A kind of defeat that she'd never seen in Earl's eyes, even during his final days. Jimmy's visit came unannounced on a Saturday morning, ostensibly to check the gutters, but clearly motivated by the same concern that had driven Becca's phone calls. His trained eye immediately noticed the small repairs that had gone undone: the loose step railing, the dripping faucet, the garden gate that hung askew. "Mom, when's the last time you had a good meal?" he asked, studying the contents of her refrigerator with the same methodical attention he brought to construction projects. The sparse shelves told their own story, a few containers of yogurt past their expiration date, some leftover soup from Mrs. Chen, and the kind of processed foods that could stretch a limited budget. "I eat plenty, James. Don't fuss." But even as she protested, Dolly realized that food had become less appealing over the past weeks, her appetite suppressed by constant low-grade nausea that seemed to emanate from the wound on her neck. The antibiotics, according to the website, could cause digestive upset, a side effect she'd accepted as evidence that they were working, even as the visible symptoms suggested otherwise. The breaking point came during a church service in late April, when the combination of stress, inadequate nutrition, and whatever was happening to her body finally overwhelmed her carefully maintained facade. Pastor Williams was delivering a sermon about faith in times of trouble when the sanctuary began to spin around Dolly like a carnival ride. She managed to grip the pew in front of her as consciousness wavered, the familiar hymns and stained glass windows blurring into a kaleidoscope of color and sound. Mrs. Chen, sitting in her usual spot 3 rows back, was the first to notice something wrong, moving with surprising speed for a woman in her 70s. "Dorothy, can you hear me?" The voice seemed to come from very far away. Though Mrs. Chen's face was close enough that Dolly could smell her familiar perfume, the same floral scent she'd worn to every Sunday service for the past 10 years. The congregation's concerned murmurs and Pastor Williams' gentle questions created a buzz of attention that made Dolly's humiliation complete. She, who had always been strong, always been capable, was now the object of pitying whispers and offers of help that felt more like evidence of failure than expressions of Christian charity. Dr. Henderson had always said that admitting weakness was the first step toward actual weakness, a philosophy that had carried her through decades of challenges. But as Mrs. Chen helped her to the church office and Pastor Williams called for medical assistance, Dolly began to understand that strength and stubbornness might not be the same thing after all. The EMTs who responded were kind but thorough, their questions probing areas that Dolly had worked hard to keep private: blood pressure elevated, pulse irregular, signs of dehydration and possible infection, all delivered in the clinical language that transformed her private struggle into public medical emergency. "Ma'am, we'd like to take you to the hospital for evaluation," the younger EMT explained, his voice carrying professional compassion mixed with genuine concern. "What you're describing sounds like something that needs immediate attention." "I can't afford the emergency room," Dolly replied, the words carrying more weight than any previous admission of vulnerability. "I've been treating it myself and it's getting better." But even as she spoke, she caught Mrs. Chen's expression, the particular look of disbelief that crossed cultural and language barriers. The wound beneath her scarf had begun to emit a smell that even careful hygiene couldn't disguise, and the antibiotics she'd ordered online seemed to be having no effect beyond the nausea and dizziness that had led to this morning's collapse. The drive home from church felt like a retreat from battle, Mrs. Chen insisting on following her car to ensure she arrived safely. The 2 women sat in Dolly's kitchen afterward, sharing tea and the kind of honest conversation that crisis sometimes demands. "My Lucy could examine you privately," Mrs. Chen offered again. "No charge, no paperwork. Just one woman helping another." The temptation was enormous, but accepting help felt like crossing a line that Dolly wasn't sure she could come back from. Independence, once lost, might never be fully recovered. And if word got back to her children that she'd been hiding a serious medical condition, the conversations about assisted living and loss of autonomy would begin in earnest. "I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Chen, but I'm handling this." As her neighbor left, carrying the weight of unspoken concern, Dolly returned to her computer to search for stronger medications, better solutions, anything that would allow her to solve this problem without surrendering her dignity. The 3rd website she found offered antibiotics that were supposedly used in hospitals, guaranteed to treat even resistant infections. The price was higher, nearly $200 that would come from next month's grocery money. But the testimonials were convincing, and the desperation that had been building for weeks finally overcame her practical caution. She placed the order with shaking fingers, telling herself that this investment would pay for itself by avoiding the thousands of dollars that proper medical treatment would cost. The package that arrived a week later looked even more professional than the previous ones, complete with what appeared to be hospital-grade packaging and detailed instructions. But as Dolly held the pills up to the light, she noticed small inconsistencies. Color variations, slightly irregular shapes, and a chemical smell that seemed different from the medication she remembered from Earl's treatments. Still, hope had become too precious to question, and she swallowed the prescribed dose with the same determination that had carried her through every previous crisis. Whatever was happening to her body, whatever these medications might or might not accomplish, she would handle it the way she'd handled everything else in her 67 years, with dignity, independence, and the kind of stubborn resilience that had defined her generation. The irony that her strength might be killing her remained hidden beneath layers of pride and desperation, waiting for someone with medical training to recognize what her love and determination had inadvertently created. The call came at 3:17 in the morning on July 15th, the shrill ring of the landline cutting through the silence of Jimmy's bedroom like a fire alarm. Linda stirred beside him, her hand automatically reaching for the lamp switch while Jimmy fumbled for the receiver, his heart already racing with the particular dread that middle-of-the-night calls brought to adult children. "This is Denver General Emergency Department," a crisp female voice announced. "Are you James Henderson, son of Dorothy Henderson?" The words that followed seemed to arrive from underwater, distorted by panic and the fog of sudden wakefulness. Ambulance, emergency admission, confusion, and delirium. The clinical terms washed over Jimmy like cold rain, but one phrase cut through his shock with crystalline clarity. "Your mother called 911 reporting that her husband was having a heart attack." She was found alone in her bedroom, severely disoriented. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of empty streets and traffic lights that seemed to take forever to change. Linda had insisted on staying with the twins, but her worried face in the rearview mirror haunted Jimmy as he navigated the familiar route to Denver General, the same hospital where Earl had died 2 years earlier, where family vigils and difficult conversations had become unwelcome routine. Becca was already there when he arrived, her scrubs wrinkled from being called away from her own night shift at the nursing home. Her professional demeanor couldn't quite mask the fear in her eyes as she guided Jimmy through the maze of emergency department corridors. "She's stable now," Becca explained, her voice carrying the careful control she'd learned from dealing with medical crises. "But Jimmy, what we saw under that scarf, it's bad. Really bad." The woman in bed 7 looked nothing like the strong, independent mother who had raised them with such fierce determination. Dolly lay unconscious beneath crisp white sheets, her silver hair spread across the pillow like a broken halo. But it was her neck that made Jimmy's breath catch in his throat. A wound that had progressed far beyond anything he'd imagined, angry and weeping despite the professional bandages that now covered it. Dr. Patricia Reeves appeared beside them with the efficient movement of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news in impossible circumstances. She was younger than Jimmy had expected, with the kind of tired eyes that spoke of too many nights like this one, too many families gathered around emergency department beds. "Your mother is suffering from necrotizing fasciitis," Dr. Reeves began, her voice gentle but clinical. "It's a severe soft tissue infection that destroys skin, fat, and muscle. Without immediate surgical intervention, she has days, not weeks." The medical terminology felt like a foreign language, but the underlying message needed no translation. Jimmy found himself gripping the bed rail with hands that suddenly seemed too large, too clumsy for the delicate work of processing information that could reshape everything he thought he knew about his mother's condition. "How long has she been like this?" Dr. Reeves continued, consulting the chart that held the clinical summary of their family crisis. "We noticed something was wrong at Easter," Becca admitted, her professional knowledge making her guilt more acute. "But she kept insisting it was just a rash. We should have forced her to come in sooner." "The progression we're seeing suggests this has been developing for months," Dr. Reeves replied, her tone carefully neutral. "What's unusual is the pattern of tissue damage. We're running additional tests, but I need you to understand the gravity of the situation." The conversation that followed felt like negotiating the terms of a nightmare. Surgery would require removing all infected tissue, which meant significant disfigurement and a recovery period measured in months rather than weeks. The cost, even with Medicare coverage, would exceed $80,000, with the family responsible for nearly $60,000 after insurance adjustments. "We'll figure out the money somehow," Becca said immediately, her voice carrying the determination that ran in their family like genetic code. "What matters is saving her life." But Jimmy's construction worker pragmatism had already begun calculating impossible equations. His modest savings, drained by his recent back surgery, Becca's single income stretched thin between her own expenses and the student loans from nursing school that never seemed to get smaller. The twins' college funds barely started. His house mortgaged to its maximum value. "Can you put a price on my mother's life?" he asked Dr. Reeves, the question carrying more weight than philosophical inquiry. "I understand this is overwhelming," Dr. Reeves replied, "but time is critical. Every hour we delay increases the risk of systemic infection." As if summoned by the conversation, Dolly's eyes fluttered open with the unfocused confusion of someone emerging from deep sedation. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, but the words carried the crushing weight of maternal love twisted into sacrifice. "Let me go, babies," she breathed, her eyes finding first Jimmy, then Becca. "Don't bankrupt yourselves for an old woman. I've had my time." The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, pregnant with the impact that was about to reshape everything they thought they understood about family obligations and impossible choices. Jimmy felt his world tilt on an axis he'd never known existed, where love and practicality existed in opposition rather than harmony. "Mom, we're not having this conversation," Becca said firmly, but her voice carried undertones of the same desperation that had driven Dolly to seek treatment online. "You're going to get better, and we're going to figure out how to pay for it." But Dolly had closed her eyes again, retreating into unconsciousness, or perhaps simply refusing to participate in discussions about her own survival. The machines monitoring her vital signs beeped with mechanical persistence, marking time in a crisis that felt both urgent and impossibly complex. Dr. Reeves stepped away to give them privacy, but her departure only emphasized the impossible weight of the decision that lay before them. Jimmy found himself staring at his mother's hands, Earl's wedding ring still gleaming on her finger despite everything else that had changed since his death. The hospital chapel was empty at 4:30 in the morning, offering the kind of institutional comfort that felt both inadequate and necessary. Jimmy and Becca sat in adjoining pews, their conversation conducted in the whispers that sacred spaces seemed to require, even when discussing thoroughly secular concerns like medical bankruptcy and family financial ruin. "I could liquidate my retirement account," Becca offered, her voice carrying the hollow determination of someone volunteering for martyrdom. "It's not much, but it's something." "And I could mortgage the house again," Jimmy replied, though they both knew his credit had been stretched thin by his own medical bills. "Maybe take out a personal loan against the construction equipment." But even as they spoke, both siblings understood they were negotiating with mathematics that didn't add up, making promises their resources couldn't fulfill. The American healthcare system, which had seemed like a distant abstraction when their family was healthy and employed, now loomed over them like a predator they'd never learned to fight. "There has to be something else," Jimmy said, his voice carrying the frustration of a man accustomed to solving problems through physical effort and determination. "Charity care, payment plans, something." The social worker who found them in the chapel an hour later looked like she'd had this conversation too many times to maintain anything beyond professional compassion. Her explanation of available resources felt like a recitation of inadequate solutions, payment plans that would stretch for decades, charity care programs with waiting lists longer than Dolly's life expectancy, and government assistance that required spending down assets to poverty levels. As dawn light began filtering through the chapel's stained glass windows, Jimmy and Becca faced the kind of choice that American families confronted every day in hospital corridors across the country: the decision between financial survival and biological survival, between protecting their children's futures and honoring their parents' past. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that their mother, who had spent her entire life avoiding becoming a burden, had inadvertently created the exact situation she'd feared most. Her attempt at independence had led directly to dependence. Her effort to spare her family had endangered them all, and her pride had transformed a treatable condition into a life-threatening crisis. But as they sat in that chapel, surrounded by the familiar symbols of faith and redemption, both siblings began to understand that love sometimes required accepting impossible burdens, and that family meant choosing each other even when the choice defied financial logic. The question wasn't whether they could afford to save their mother's life. The question was whether they could afford not to try. The surgery lasted 6 hours and 43 minutes, each second measured by the industrial clock in the family waiting area that seemed designed to amplify anxiety rather than provide comfort. Jimmy had worn a path in the linoleum between the vending machines and the windows that looked out onto Denver's morning traffic, while Becca alternated between researching necrotizing fasciitis on her phone and making calls to banks about emergency loans that would probably be denied. Linda had brought the twins to see their grandmother before the procedure, a decision that now seemed both necessary and cruel. 8-year-old Lily had stared at the bandages covering Dolly's neck with the wide-eyed fascination that children brought to things adults preferred to hide, while Rose had pressed a handmade get-well card into her grandmother's palm with the fierce determination of someone who believed love could cure anything. "Will Grandma be okay?" Lily had asked Dr. Reeves with the brutal directness that made adults uncomfortable, demanding honesty that medical professionals were trained to soften. "We're going to do everything we can," Dr. Reeves had replied, the standard response that promised nothing while acknowledging everything. But Jimmy had caught the look that passed between the surgeon and the anesthesiologist, a communication conducted in glances that spoke of complications beyond what they'd discussed with the family. The financial counselor who appeared during hour 3 of the surgery looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, her clipboard filled with forms that seemed designed to extract commitments from people too emotionally devastated to read the fine print. The payment plan she outlined would consume 40% of Jimmy's monthly income for the next 15 years. Assuming he remained continuously employed in an industry notorious for seasonal layoffs and economic volatility. "We understand this is a difficult time," she said with practiced sympathy, "but the hospital does require a financial commitment before we can proceed with post-operative care." Becca had signed the papers with shaking hands, her signature committing her to liquidate every asset she'd accumulated during 10 years of working double shifts and living in a studio apartment she couldn't really afford. The retirement account that represented her only security would disappear into medical bills, leaving her financially where she'd been at 25, except with a decade more wear on her body and no time to recover. But it was Jimmy who bore the heaviest burden, his decision to refinance their modest home effectively gambling his family's shelter against his mother's survival. The loan officer he'd reached by phone had been professionally polite while explaining that the equity wouldn't cover the full amount, leaving them still $30,000 short even after sacrificing everything they owned. The call to Uncle Robert, Earl's estranged brother who had struck it rich in oil and gas, represented a humiliation that Jimmy had never imagined he'd endure. 20 years of family silence dissolved in a desperate phone conversation that reduced him to begging from a relative who remembered every slight and nursed every grudge with the patience of someone who had always known this day would come. So, "The proud Henderson family finally needs help," Robert had said, his voice carrying satisfaction that made Jimmy's jaw clench with inherited rage. "Your daddy always thought he was too good to ask for anything." "This isn't about pride, Uncle Robert. This is about my mother's life. Everything's about pride with you people." "But I suppose I could see my way to helping, for old time's sake." The conditions that followed felt like selling their souls in installments. Robert would cover the remaining medical expenses, but the family would acknowledge his generosity publicly, attend his upcoming wedding to a woman younger than Becca, and name their first grandchild after him. The humiliation was complete, but Jimmy had agreed without hesitation, understanding that dignity was a luxury they could no longer afford. When Dr. Reeves finally emerged from the operating room, her surgical scrubs were stained with evidence of the battle she'd fought inside Dolly's body. The masked lines around her eyes spoke of hours spent under intense concentration, and her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had wrestled with death and achieved only partial victory. "We've removed all the infected tissue," she reported, her clinical language unable to soften the visual reality of what that meant. "But the damage was extensive. Your mother will survive, but she'll need months of recovery and multiple reconstructive procedures." The word that hung unspoken between them was disfigurement, the permanent alteration of the woman who had once been beautiful enough to catch Earl's eye at a county fair dance, confident enough to raise 2 children while working full-time, strong enough to nurse her husband through cancer without ever letting him see her cry. Recovery room visits were limited to 10 minutes every 2 hours, a clinical rhythm that felt both protective and cruel. Dolly lay unconscious beneath layers of bandages that transformed her into someone unrecognizable, machines monitoring vital signs that fluctuated with each breath. The strong hands that had kneaded bread and tended gardens lay motionless on crisp white sheets, IV lines delivering medications that cost more per day than her usual weekly grocery budget. Jimmy found himself talking to her unconscious form with the same desperate hope that had driven him to Earl's bedside 2 years earlier, as if words could anchor someone to life through sheer force of will. He told her about the twins' latest school achievements, Linda's promotion at work, Becca's plans to specialize in geriatric care, all the normal family news that seemed surreal in the antiseptic environment of intensive care. But it was during his third vigil, when exhaustion had worn away his careful composure, that Jimmy finally spoke the truth that had been building inside him since that first phone call. "Mom, I don't know if we can do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the mechanical sounds of life support. "The money, the recovery, all of it. I'm scared we're going to lose everything, and I'm scared it still won't be enough." The confession hung in the air between them, honest in a way that their family had rarely allowed itself to be. Jimmy had inherited Earl's stoicism, along with his work ethic, but the weight of supporting multiple generations while watching his mother fade away had finally exceeded his capacity for silent endurance. When Becca found him an hour later, crying quietly beside their mother's bed, she didn't offer false comfort or empty reassurances. Instead, she pulled a second chair close to his and shared the silence that their family had never learned to fill with adequate words. Outside, Denver continued its daily routine of traffic and commerce, while inside the intensive care unit, 3 generations of American dreams hung in the balance, measured in heartbeats and bank balances, sustained by love and threatened by a healthcare system that had transformed healing into a luxury few could afford. The tragedy wasn't just medical anymore, it had become existential, forcing them to confront the fundamental question of what family meant when caring for each other required destroying the security they'd spent lifetimes building. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation or tearful confession, but through the methodical investigation of Dr. Mitchell, a specialist in infectious diseases who had been called in to consult on Dolly's unusually resistant case. His interest had been piqued not by the severity of her condition, but by the peculiar pattern of tissue damage that suggested something beyond typical necrotizing fasciitis. Jimmy was reading a construction trade magazine he'd found in the family lounge when Dr. Mitchell appeared beside him, carrying a manila folder thick with test results, and wearing the expression of someone who had discovered something both significant and disturbing. "Mr. Henderson, I need to ask you about your mother's medical history," Dr. Mitchell began, his voice carrying professional urgency tempered by genuine compassion. "Specifically, what medications she's been taking over the past few months." "She's been pretty secretive about it," Jimmy admitted, closing the magazine and giving the doctor his full attention. "We knew she was treating something at home, but she wouldn't let us help or even see what she was dealing with." Dr. Mitchell opened the folder and withdrew several plastic evidence bags containing pill fragments and packaging materials that Jimmy recognized with growing dread. These were items from Dolly's house, medications that Becca must have collected when she'd gone to pack their mother's belongings for the extended hospital stay. "Your mother has been poisoned," Dr. Mitchell said simply, the words carrying weight that seemed to alter the very air in the room. "These aren't antibiotics. They're counterfeit medications containing industrial chemicals, zinc oxide, titanium dioxide, and several other compounds that are toxic when ingested over time." The room seemed to tilt around Jimmy as the implications settled into place. His mother hadn't been suffering from some mysterious infection that defied treatment. She had been slowly killing herself with fake medications purchased online in a desperate attempt to avoid the very medical costs that had ultimately consumed their family's financial future anyway. "What does this mean for her recovery?" Jimmy asked, though part of him already understood that the question itself had fundamentally changed. "It means we've been treating the wrong problem," Dr. Mitchell replied. "The tissue damage we're seeing is consistent with chemical burns from the inside out. Once we stop the poisoning and begin proper detoxification protocols, she should recover much more quickly than we initially predicted." Becca arrived as Dr. Mitchell was explaining the full scope of the counterfeit drug problem, an international criminal enterprise that targeted vulnerable populations with fake medications sold at prices that seemed too good to be true because they were exactly that. Dolly had become an unwitting victim of her own resourcefulness, her desire to spare her family driving her into the arms of predators who profited from desperation. "How many others are out there?" Becca asked, her nursing training automatically expanding the scope beyond their family's immediate crisis. "We're tracking 47 similar cases in Colorado alone," Dr. Mitchell admitted. "Your mother's situation has helped us identify a major supplier network. The FBI is already building a case." The federal investigation that followed transformed Dolly from patient to key witness in a criminal case that spanned multiple states and involved millions of dollars in fraudulent medical sales. The legal implications changed everything about their financial situation. Victim compensation funds, criminal restitution, and media attention that brought donations from strangers who recognized their own healthcare fears in the Henderson family's struggle. But perhaps more importantly, it revealed the secret that Dr. Mitchell had been carrying for 23 years of medical practice. As he sat with Jimmy and Becca in the family conference room, his professional demeanor gave way to something more personal, more vulnerable. "I need to tell you something about why your mother's case matters so much to me," he began, his hands folded carefully on the table between them. 30 years ago, I was 8 years old when my own mother died from a treatable infection. We couldn't afford proper medical care, and she tried to manage it herself with home remedies and prayer." The confession hung between them, connecting their family's current crisis to Dr. Mitchell's lifetime of medical dedication, his decision to specialize in infectious diseases, his reputation for taking difficult cases, his willingness to work with uninsured patients, all of it stemmed from a childhood trauma that mirrored their current situation. "I became a doctor to prevent exactly what happened to your mother," he continued, "and I'm not going to let the system fail another family the way it failed mine." What followed was an unprecedented gesture in Jimmy's experience with health care. Dr. Mitchell waived his entire professional fee, not as charity, but as principle. More than that, he activated a network of specialists who shared his philosophy that medicine should heal rather than bankrupt, doctors who had been quietly subsidizing care for patients caught between insurance gaps and impossible choices. The community response that emerged seemed to spring from some deep well of shared experience that Jimmy hadn't realized existed. Pastor Williams organized not just a prayer chain, but a practical support network that included meals, transportation, and respite care. The construction crews Jimmy had worked with over the years contributed labor for home modifications that would ease Dolly's recovery. Even Mrs. Chen's extended family mobilized, providing the kind of intergenerational support that their own scattered American family structure had made difficult to achieve. Most surprising was the response from Dolly's former workplace at the school district, where her 30 years as a cafeteria worker had apparently left deeper impressions than anyone had realized. The Employee Assistance Fund that Jimmy had never known existed suddenly materialized with resources specifically designated for retirees facing medical emergencies. But it was Uncle Robert's unexpected visit that provided the emotional crescendo to their family's transformation. The man who had humiliated Jimmy during his desperate phone call appeared at the hospital carrying not demands for gratitude, but a confession of his own. "Your daddy and I never got along because we were too much alike," Robert admitted, his oil-field roughness softened by something that might have been regret. "Too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to offer it without strings attached. But watching what you've done for your mother, that's what Earl would have wanted." The check he left covered not just the remaining medical expenses, but established an education fund for the twins, as if money could somehow compensate for the years of family estrangement that had deprived them all of connections that might have made this crisis less devastating. As the pieces of their shattered financial future began reassembling into something sustainable, Jimmy found himself understanding that the real revelation wasn't about counterfeit drugs or criminal conspiracies. It was about the difference between independence and isolation, between strength and stubbornness, between the kind of pride that protected dignity and the kind that prevented healing. Dr. Mitchell's final consultation before transferring Dolly to a standard recovery room carried news that seemed almost anticlimactic after everything they'd endured. Her body was responding well to detoxification treatments. The tissue damage would heal with proper care, and the scarring, while permanent, would be far less severe than they'd initially feared. "Your mother is going to live," he said simply, words that should have been celebratory but felt more like confirmation of something they'd fought too hard to doubt. But as Jimmy sat beside Dolly's hospital bed that evening, watching her sleep peacefully for the first time in months, he realized that survival was only the beginning of their family's real recovery. They had learned something about the cost of caring for each other in a system designed to make such care financially impossible, and they had discovered that love sometimes required accepting help with the same courage it took to offer it. The woman who had raised them to be independent had taught them, through her own vulnerability, that true independence meant building communities strong enough to catch each other when individual strength inevitably proved insufficient. It was a lesson written in scars and medical bills, purchased with pride and paid for with the kind of grace that emerges when people choose each other despite the cost. Christmas Eve arrived 6 months later with the kind of Colorado snowfall that transformed ordinary suburban landscapes into something approaching magic. Dolly stood at her kitchen window, watching fat flakes drift past the glass while her hands worked automatically through the familiar ritual of preparing dinner rolls, Earl's favorite recipe that she'd almost forgotten during the long months of recovery. The scar that traced from her collarbone toward her ear had faded to a thin silver line, visible but no longer angry, no longer shameful. She touched it absently while counting place settings, a gesture that had evolved from self-conscious concealment to simple acknowledgement. Dr. Mitchell had been right about many things, but most importantly about this. Healing left marks that told stories worth remembering rather than hiding. The dining room table, extended to its full length for the first time since Earl's death, groaned under the weight of their expanded family celebration. 14 place settings instead of the lonely single plate that had marked so many solitary meals during those dark months of pride and isolation. Mrs. Chen had contributed homemade dumplings alongside Dolly's traditional ham, while Dr. Mitchell's wife had brought a dessert that somehow managed to accommodate every dietary restriction their multi-generational gathering required. Jimmy emerged from the basement carrying Earl's good china, pieces that had been stored away since the funeral as if celebration had died with him. His back moved easier now, the stress-induced tension that had plagued him during the crisis gradually loosening as their family's financial situation stabilized through victim compensation funds and the unexpected generosity of people who understood that medical emergencies could happen to anyone. "Mom, Linda wants to know if you need help in the kitchen," he called, though they both knew the offer was more about including Dolly in conversation than actual necessity. The twins had spent the morning teaching their grandmother to use the tablet computer they'd given her for Christmas. Their patient instruction in technology somehow reversing the traditional educational flow between generations. Becca arrived carrying her contribution to dinner and the bound manuscript of the book she'd been writing, a practical guide for families navigating healthcare crises that had grown from her blog posts about their experience. The publisher interested in her work had specifically mentioned the authenticity that came from lived experience rather than academic theory, validation that their struggle had produced something useful beyond their own survival. "The FBI case goes to trial next month," Becca announced, settling into the kitchen routine that had become their family's way of processing important news through shared activity. "The prosecutor thinks they'll get convictions on all counts." Dolly nodded while checking the ham's internal temperature, her movement steady despite the significance of the update. Serving as a key witness in the federal case against the counterfeit drug ring had transformed her from victim to advocate, her testimony helping prosecutors build cases that could prevent other families from enduring similar ordeals. The doorbell announced the arrival of Pastor Williams and his wife, followed closely by 3 elderly neighbors who had become part of their extended celebration through the informal care network that had emerged from their crisis. Mrs. Chen's daughter Lucy, the doctor who had first offered to examine Dolly informally, brought her own children, creating the kind of intergenerational gathering that felt both intentional and organic. Dr. Mitchell arrived last, carrying flowers for Dolly and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had received the best possible Christmas gift. The medical practice he'd helped establish for underserved patients had secured permanent funding through a combination of federal grants and private donations, ensuring that families facing healthcare crises would have advocates rather than just bills. As they gathered around the extended table, Dolly looked at faces that represented the community she'd never realized she needed. The isolation that had nearly killed her had been replaced by connections that felt both practical and profound, people who checked on each other not from obligation but from understanding that individual strength had limits that collective care could transcend. "Before we say grace," Dolly began, her voice carrying the authority that had always made her family listen, I want to thank everyone who helped us learn the difference between being strong and being stubborn. The blessing that followed acknowledged not just the food before them, but the year of struggle that had brought them to this moment. Earl's empty chair remained empty, but his presence felt less like absence and more like continuance. His values of hard work and family loyalty evolved to include the kind of interdependence that their crisis had revealed as essential. 8-year-old Rose raised her hand with the serious demeanor she brought to important announcements. "Grandma, can you tell the story about how you became famous?" The request had become ritual, their family's way of transforming trauma into narrative, crisis into testimony. But tonight, Dolly found herself telling a different version of the story, one that emphasized not the medical emergency or financial devastation, but the discovery that accepting help honored relationships rather than diminishing them. "The most important thing I learned," she concluded, looking around the table at faces that had become dear through shared struggle, "is that Earl was wrong about one thing. Money doesn't grow on trees, but love multiplies when you share it, and it heals when you let others help carry it." After dinner, as the younger generation handled cleanup with the efficiency of people who had learned to work together through necessity, Dolly retreated to her bedroom for a quiet moment with Earl's photograph. The conversation she'd been having with his image for 2 years had evolved from desperate consultation to peaceful reflection. "Earl, darling," she whispered, touching the silver frame that held his favorite picture, "I thought losing you meant losing everything. But maybe grief taught me something about love that I couldn't learn any other way. Our grandbabies will remember this year not as the time Grandma got sick, but as the time our family learned to take care of each other." The sound of laughter drifting from the living room, Jimmy's construction crew humor mixing with Mrs. Chen's gentle teasing and the twins' unguarded joy, created a soundtrack that felt like answer enough. Earl's workshop had been converted into a guest room for visiting family members, his tools redistributed to Jimmy and neighbors who would use them to maintain the kind of community connections that made individual crises bearable. 1 year later, as Dolly reflected on their Christmas Eve tradition that now included 14 regular participants and a waiting list of people who wanted to join, she understood that their family's American dream had been redefined. Success wasn't individual achievement that could be lost to medical bills or economic downturns. It was collective resilience that grew stronger through shared vulnerability. The counterfeit drug manufacturers had been sentenced to federal prison terms that reflected the scope of their crimes, but more importantly, the Victim Compensation Fund had helped 847 other families avoid the financial devastation that healthcare crises could create. Dolly's story had become part of congressional testimony about healthcare reform, evidence that individual strength needed systemic support to remain sustainable. As snow continued falling outside, covering the familiar landscape in pristine possibility, Dolly understood that some scars were worth bearing because they told stories of survival, community, and the kind of love that multiplied when shared rather than hoarded. Dorothy Henderson's story isn't just about surviving a medical crisis. It's about rediscovering what true strength looks like in our golden years. At 67, she learned that the independence we've fought so hard to maintain can sometimes become a prison that isolates us from the very people who love us most. Her journey from stubborn self-reliance to graceful interdependence reveals a profound truth. Accepting help doesn't diminish our dignity. It honors the relationships we've spent a lifetime building. When Dorothy finally allowed her children, neighbors, and community to care for her, she discovered that love multiplies when shared, healing accelerates when burdens are carried together, and that the legacy we leave isn't measured by how little we needed others, but by how courageously we let them love us. Her Christmas table expanded from one lonely place setting to 14 joyful faces, represents the abundance that awaits when we choose connection over isolation. Dorothy's scar became not a mark of shame, but a badge of survival and wisdom, proof that vulnerability can be the gateway to the deepest happiness we've ever known. Sometimes our greatest strength is found in admitting we need each other, and our richest years begin when we stop trying to carry life's burdens alone. What family traditions have you had to reimagine after major life changes, and how did they become even more meaningful? Have you ever discovered that asking for help actually strengthened your relationships rather than weakened them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.